Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen, and today I'm going over the worst books that I read in 2022. So to give a quick preface to this video, this is a set of books that I was either disappointed by or I DNF'd or just didn't do it for me personally. But I will say there is something to enjoy in this list of books. I tend to be quite open and receptive in my reading. I try to find something that I like in everything that I read. But I will say, I have to be honest, when books aren't doing it for me. And I feel like I'm quite attuned to my taste. I know what I'm going to like. So I think that helps me not DNF too frequently or give scathing or negative reviews of books. But this set did have some stuff that I did not enjoy or I was disappointed by, what have you. But let's get into it. So the first two books I have here are books that I DNF'd, which is kind of a rare thing for me this year. I realized that I think I might have missed one or two that I've DNF'd, and I was looking at my shelves and I was like, damn, I should have marked them down better, like on Goodreads or something. But I know I DNF'd these two. And it's a rare thing anyway, so maybe these are the only two. I don't know. But anyways, they are Fairy Tale by Stephen King and How to Read Now by Elaine Castillo. Very different books, so let's just get into it. The first one being Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Growing up, Stephen King was my favorite writer, and I haven't read him in many, many years. And I know his writing has kind of changed over the years. He's an older dude now, and I wanted to try his newest book because I wanted to see if I still liked him and see how much I've changed potentially as a reader. And I will say I didn't even hate this book. I just was very bored by it at the midway point. So I think this book is like over 600 pages. It's about a young guy who embarks on this journey, this fairy tale essentially, when he finds a hidden like passageway under this old guy's shed in his backyard who he befriends. The old guy dies, he befriends his dog, he cares for the dog. And so it's very like Stephen King, small town, young boy, befriending a dog, finds something mysterious, horror ensues, right? It seems very traditionally quintessential King in my mind. But I got to the point where the kid, he finds the underground passageway to this other hidden land. I was listening to the audiobook. It was really well performed and I was kind of into it. I was starting to get into it, but then I was like, do I really am I invested? Do I care? And I realized I didn't care. So I've been trying to uphold the standard in my mind where if you're not enjoying a book or you don't want to see what happens, or if you're finding yourself bored by it, life's too short. And so I DNF'd it, and I don't really feel too bad about that. And then the next book is How to Read Now by Elaine Castillo. And I feel like this is probably the hottest take that I'll have in this video. This could be a whole separate video of me trying to unpack my ideas around why I didn't like this book and why I DNF'd it, also at the 50% mark. But I'll quickly try to summarize what I was feeling about this book. I picked this up. I really like reading literary criticism. This year, a trend for my reading has been really thinking about why I read certain books, how to read more critically, and I'm always receptive to new ways of thinking about books and really trying to test myself and figure out why I think certain things, which is why I have this booktube channel in the first place. I was hyped to read this. I know some friends of mine really like Elaine Castillo's fiction. I think she has one debut novel called America Is Not the Heart. And I still want to read that book, but this collection of essays I found to be really contradictory, really incendiary and angry, but didn't really, and I tended to disagree with many of the things that Elaine Castillo was saying, which made me feel very weird because I agreed with the general sentiment about the topics presented in these essays, but the way that she argued them and the ultimate conclusions about what we should be reading, what we can read, how to read critically, despite certain bad things about an artist, I just fundamentally disagreed with. And I was getting a bit annoyed by the end or by the middle mark of this book that I knew I didn't want to finish it anymore. And I talked to my friend CJ about this, and we had like a really good generative discussion about this book, which was really helpful for me to understand why I wasn't enjoying it. Yeah, I mean, basically, one of the core essays here is about empathy in fiction or the falsity of generating empathy through reading. And it's a really critical takedown of Peter Hanke, who is a really bad person in real life, but the essay was really about separating the art from the artist. Didn't really agree with her conclusions about whether books by bad people should still be read or whether they should be read or can still be read, whether there's any literary merit to them, the various excuses that she proposes that people have for sort of sympathizing with or still condoning reading those books. And I don't know, I was really put off by her arguments. And if you were interested in me doing like a whole essay or a video about this, I would love to. If you've read this book, I'd love to talk to you about it as well, because I did find myself being quite challenged by it. So I am glad that I read it because it challenged my own thinking about these topics, but I did disagree with her, and I also just didn't enjoy the reading of it because her arguments felt very contradictory, angry to the point where it felt like it wasn't, I just didn't like it for those reasons. That was probably a poor way of putting that, but I hope that kind of made sense why I didn't enjoy it. why I DNF'd it, but that was really shocking for me that I did not enjoy a piece of lit crit. Usually I like most criticism that I read, even if it's something that I don't agree with. That's not necessarily why I stopped it. I just didn't like the writing and the reading experience of it. I found it very dry and annoying to read. Very receptive to counter arguments, and I love debate. I'm a lawyer as well, so like that's not the issue. But yeah, that was a weird one. So those are my two DNFs, and now I'll get into two disappointments that I had, and then the rest are books that, oh no, three disappointments, and then the rest are books that I just didn't really like. So the first one is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I read this book this month. This is my first McCarthy book, and I was really, I was bummed because I have a few of his books that I picked up, and I asked for some recommendations from people about where to start with Cormac McCarthy. And most people said The Road or Blood Meridian. And so I went with The Road because it's the one that seems to be the most famous out of all of them. I liked the story. I thought the father-son dynamic of them in a post-apocalyptic wasteland trying to survive, and the novel being about faith and resilience and love. I found all of those seemed to be really poignant and really effectively explored through the narrative. But I will say the writing here I didn't love that much. I found that this interesting mix of like very minute details of what the father and son are doing in terms of scavenging for goods or the description of the wasteland around them, the setting, contrasted with these very like poetic vignettes about like resilience and faith, like I mentioned. I found it to be kind of jarring and really boring at times. Another thing that I thought about too for this was one of my favorite games of all time is The Last of Us, both part one and two. And this book reminded me of it so much that I was like, is this because I love those games? And I think like visually seeing it, playing it myself, it told a very similar story in a much more, I don't know, like visceral way for me, like being in the game, that sort of made this feel more dry. I don't know, but that's kind of my initial thought. Was I was sort of disappointed by the telling of this. But I don't think it's a bad book by any means. I just thought for me, this like sort of very clipped poetic blend of like those sort of philosophical inquiries with the minute detailing of everything going on didn't work for me. And then another one is Weather by Jenny Awful. This is a reread of mine that I did for a vlog in which I tried to reread some authors that I didn't enjoy in the past. And I will say, upon reread, I liked this book more than I originally did, but I still found it to be disappointing. So this book was another one that uses fragments like The Road. And I think that is something that I don't love myself. I feel like it kind of leaves room for much to be desired in both of these books. But I think in this instance of Weather, it follows a mom and wife as she is considering climate change. It's very stream of consciousness on that front. But I think in this case with Jenny Awful, I don't really enjoy the way often that she writes into humor. And I feel like sometimes I'm kind of left feeling like kind of confused, or I felt like it's sort of twee or a little too scattered in the way that it's sort of presenting the stream of consciousness style, that it doesn't really lend to strong characterization. The jokes aren't hitting that much for me. And I just wish it was a little bit more congealed to actually say something more. But I understand it's not what she's trying to go for. But I just think for me as a reader, I found that sort of clip style left much to be desired. That was Weather. I didn't love it that much, but I did like it more. So like I will try Jenny Awful again. But I also didn't like Department of Speculation. So like, I don't know if it's the fragments aren't doing it for me or what, but I noticed in both The Road and Weather, the use of fragments did not do them much service for me as a reader. The next disappointment for me was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Another controversial take maybe, but this one I didn't love. I think it was something to do with the repetition of the way this book is presented. So if you've read this book, you know what I mean in terms of it. It was back in like March I read this, I think, but the way it presents each chapter says where the character is in this labyrinth, and it's very repetitive. And I did it on audiobook, so it was really annoying to keep hearing the same refrain of where the person was in this labyrinth. But then also, I feel like this book kind of dabbles in some of the trauma plot discourse that's been going on this year that I've been really talking about a lot on my channel, about writers that use the sort of mystery of a character's past to develop character and plot. And sometimes I think that can be a little bit not rewarding for me as a reader, and I tend to find myself feeling that the narrative is lacking because of it. This book I think is not really, it's not the worst case of the trauma plot that I've read, because I think the fantasy world building, it being set in a labyrinth, the reader not really knowing anything about the world sort of is more immersive on that front, rather than it being set strictly in reality. I feel like many trauma plots are rooted in some form of reality, so it's a little bit less effective because there's less mystery and presented in Piranesi, if that makes sense. And just seeing how much praise this book received, it didn't really pay off for me on that front, but I did think the mystery was quite effective. I thought the ending was quite beautiful, but overall, it wasn't my favorite. So those are my three disappointments, and then I'll go into the books that I did not enjoy for other reasons. So, first one I have is After Claude by Iris Owens. This is a book that was published back in 1974. It is a New York Review of Books book, which I tend to enjoy. This one, it started quite strong, but it really fell apart for me for like the first quarter of the book. So essentially, we followed this woman who gives moshfegh, gives like the disaster woman trope a run for their money in terms of presenting the most like scathing, incendiary, nasty, vile presentation of a character that I've read in recent memory in terms of her takes, of her being just incredibly loathsome. I don't mind any of that in my fiction. That is not my problem with this book. I found it to be just incredibly fucking boring, which is like the number one fault for me when I'm reading books is if you're boring, that's not good. So that was the thing for me with this book. I found the character to be quite interesting to read, particularly at the start. It was really interesting reading a book that was set almost 50 years in the past and seeing this character that feels like something that would be like book talk bait in terms of her being so kind of embodying the female rage trope that's really, all of the rage right now online in bookish communities. But by the midpoint of this book, when a different plot point is introduced and then us staying with this character, I just felt very from a narrative perspective, this book was just incredibly boring. I didn't really care what was going to happen next. I felt the stakes weren't really there. She kind of overstayed her welcome in terms of the narration. I kind of got the point of it, and it sort of lost its luster by the midpoint. Kind of like a more hidden deep cut in this list, but wasn't for me. Next up is New Animal by Ella Baxter. This is another depressed woman moving through the world novel that I really, really wanted to enjoy. I love this cover. Has like all of the setup for something that I would enjoy, but I found the characterization to also lend itself to being boring. I think that's a through line here, is just me being bored with these books. But this one follows a woman who works in the family business of a mortuary in Australia. And one day her mother abruptly dies. And so that kind of strikes close to home in terms of her having to deal with her own grief as a result of her family member passing. And then she flees to Tasmania and she becomes involved in this BDSM scene to sort of cope with the grief that she's experiencing. I have a whole discussion with CJ from CJ Reads about this book for her book club, in which we kind of unpack all of this. So if you're interested, I will link that below as well. There wasn't enough setup in terms of the characterization to understand why the main character was behaving in the way that she was to sort of grapple with these feelings of grief. And so I understood that the author was trying to portray the sort of abruptness and oddness that comes with grief and the sort of unpredictable nature that can cause people to act in when they are dealing with abrupt personal grief. But I found that from a reader's perspective, I didn't really understand the stakes and also the characterization of this person to understand why she was doing what she was doing. So it felt like I was just kind of like voyeuristically watching like a random person behave in random ways and didn't really like care for what was going on because of that. And so it has like an interesting setup. It has like the mortuary business of the family. It has the BDSM stuff in it, but it kind of feels like it's just throwing stuff onto like a cold plate of bad food. You know what I mean? There's not enough setup there to try to season the bad food, if that makes sense. So that's New Animal for me. I will try Ella Baxter again though. I do think she has promise as a writer. This one didn't do it for me because of those reasons. But I do think her writing was still strong. She has good ideas. It just needs to congeal in a way that works better for me next time. So we'll see. Next, I have I Fear My Pain Interests You by Stephanie LaCava. This is another one that I was really disappointed not to love. I thought I was going to love it. This one follows a young woman. It's another depressed woman moving book. And it opens up on a plane. She has family who I think they're musicians or they're actors or something. They're famous, and she's basically their daughter, so she's born into fame in a sense. She's leaving an abusive relationship and she's going to Montana. I forget why she's going to Montana in specific, but then she meets another guy and their relationship is weird. If you can't tell, this book kind of left my brain, so I apologize for the scant plot summary, but basically this book is a look at body horror and a certain French movement called, I think, Cinema de Corpse or something. It's about body horror, I believe. I should have researched this before I started this video, but essentially it's kind of using this body horror take in a literary form and exploring this woman who is privileged, has suffered abuse at the hands of another man, her trying to navigate a different relationship and how that sort of the fallout from there. I will say for me, this one didn't do it for me, again, because of characterization, but also because this sort of icy, clipped, cold, removed prose style in this book didn't lend itself to effectively kind of reaching any conclusions or doing anything interesting with the narrative to make it congeal in my mind or kind of stay there. Like as I'm saying now, I'm having a hard time even remembering what this character, who she was, why she was on a plane, like what she was fleeing from. It felt very like discombobulated on that front. And I think it's supposed to feel like that, but I think there was some issues with prose and characterization and using too much like removal to give this sort of effect of iciness and like depressed women moving that it just didn't work for me in particular. I do remember the ending, which I really liked. Like the last page was a memorable image. Okay, next is we had to remove this post by Hannah Bervowitz. This was a book that I thought I was going to love. It is a quick little novella about a young woman who is a content moderator. And so what that means is she has to field different images on social media sites that contain incredibly graphic, incredibly depraved images. And so this book is exploring the effects that that would have on a young woman who's also in a queer relationship and looking at the sort of corporate complicity and exposing people to these images and how that can kind of play out from there. And why I did not like this book was because the end felt so corny to me. Ooh, this I was so mad when I finished this book, and that's not usually a response that I have to books. It felt so obvious and like annoying in the way that there's no real setup into how the ending comes. I don't want to spoil the book, but essentially you understand the themes that I'm presenting here, right? She's viewing content that is terrible and it's about the effects that that has on her. But then things abruptly kind of switch in the narrative. The idea and the foundation is interesting, but then the development of her as a character, the reasons why she ends up doing things that she does later, is not developed at all, other than it just relying on this basic fundamental setup of the narrative about it being about content moderation. You know what I mean? So like there's not enough meat on the bones for it to feel like a substantive character study of why this woman has behaved in this way. So there's like two things. There's the climax that I was like, oh my God, like, okay. And then the end was also like, okay. I just thought this one was really corny. And the last two books are definitely my two least favorite books of the year. First one is Hell of a Book by Jason Mott. And this is another one that I had a hard time with grappling why I didn't like it. But again, this is one that I think suffers from the aforementioned trauma plot. So even in Parul Segal's piece about the trauma plot, she talks about in that essay how this book, Hell of a Book, is a victim of the trauma plot. And I wholeheartedly agree. It follows a Black writer who is on a press tour for his book, which is also a part of the book that you're reading. So you kind of get jumping perspectives between this young boy who is the focus of this writer's book. And so we were kind of reading that book. And then we're also reading the present real moment of this author on a press tour, talking about the book, talking about what it's about, him trying to explain the trauma that's going on in the book. It's a piece of autofiction, a blend of like autofiction and metafiction. But to me, by the end of it, this book I think kind of suffers from it trying to do too much in terms of metafiction and autofiction, blurring the line between these two characters and trying to say something I think that is incredibly important about publishing, about being Black in America, about police brutality. It has all these really incredibly important topics that are discussed here. And I think the sentiments and ideas and themes are incredibly important. But I think as a novel, in the use of this form, I did not think it worked well because even by the end of it, when certain reveals are had and we learn more about the metafiction going on, the autofictional lines that are blurred, and like the final 50 pages, it feels incredibly didactic and just not, it's telling way too much versus showing, and it kind of tries to congeal everything very quickly, and it just doesn't feel effective and kind of feels like it was doing too much. That was hell of a book, but this book did win the National Book Award. I think I'm one of the few that didn't like this book for that reason. And so the last book on my list, which is definitely my least favorite book of the year, I read this back in like early 2022. It is Notes on an Execution by Dania Kukafka. This is a book that had a lot of promise, and I think the impetus for its creation and why Dania Kukafka has said that she wanted to write this book, I wish I read that book than the book that I did read. Basically, this follows a man who's on death row for being a serial killer. And so he's on death row, and much of the book is set in the second person. So it's placing you in the seat of this killer leading up to your death, I think in like 12 hours or something. And so that is like the narrative through line here. But then what the book is trying to do is give three other perspectives of women who have been impacted by this man's murder. And so In the ARC copy of this book, Daniel Kafka talks about how she wanted to center women's stories and try to, I guess, like desensationalize the murderer in these stories. That is often the case with true crime generally, is when we are so fascinated by a murder, trying to understand why he did what he did rather than actually looking at the people that he impacted and those women's stories in this book. And so, love that, wanted to read that book. But I do think that this book kind of feels like it was suffering from publishing or an editor that was trying to make this more marketable to a mystery and thriller audience, really playing into the idea of someone wanting to know more about the killer. And so basically, what I'm saying is we have shifting perspectives of three women, and we also have the perspective in the second person of this killer on death row. But the book feels so obsessed with the killer that it was very clear to me that this did not succeed in what it was trying to do on that front. The other three characters feel very flat to me in their stories, and the strongest one does seem to be the killer. And it's not because of my own fascination with the killer, it's because of how much time is spent exploring him and also putting you even in the shoes of the killer leading up to the death sentence, to his ultimate execution by the end of the novel, which is not a spoiler to say. Which I think all the things were effective in terms of it really making you think about the death penalty critically. But I do wish that the other parts of the novel, which seem to be the core of it, they felt very meager and very weak in comparison. And so for that, I was really bummed out by it, feeling like in an edit or something, they wanted this book to feel more mysterious or more thrilling and really wanting to get into the head of the killer, which seems to sort of contravene what Daniel Kafka was setting up in this book. So I don't know who was at fault for that, but as a reader, I did not love it, and I felt really annoyed by it. And also, like the purple prose in this book it just felt so overwritten and just really bad on that front too. But I think there is a promising book here, and I will say though, aside from that, I do think that the book that sort of feels like a more effective way of doing this was Devil House by John Darnielle, which came out this year. That book is really considering true crime, the sort of inherent fucked upness of true crime, in a really interesting metafictional way of looking at the people affected by true crime in a way that's so much better to me. Devil House is a masterpiece in terms of metafiction and how he uses 7 parts to really explore how horrible it is that people are obsessed with true crime, and really makes you reconsider why we are, as an audience, very enraptured by killers and what that really means and how that affects real people in real life. And so this is basically a plug for Devil House, I guess. But anyways, yeah, those are my least favorite books of the year. Yeah, I would love to know what your least favorite book of the year was. And again, this is not to be a slight on any of these writers or anything, but I had to give some insight into what I did not like this year. So hopefully you get a better understanding of where I'm coming from as a content creator, as a reader. And it also helps me think about why I think certain things. So I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, consider giving me a like, consider subscribing, leave a comment, and I'll catch you all in the next one, which will be the best books of 2022. Anyways, I will catch you all in the next one. Bye.